can undergo biofouling, and this is increasing the relative density with respect to the fluid. So the settling can be even higher. Clearly, if you think of these densities in the frame of atmospheric plastic dispersion, then these fibers will be much, much heavier than the fluid that is carrying them. So in general terms, what is really not very well known yet is the problem of microplastic dispersion in turbulent environments. What we need to understand much better is how these hotspot accumulation occurs in turbulent environments. This is something that we have already heard a lot about, the fact that microplastics are accumulating in some regions of the flow. Clearly, in order to understand the mechanism that lead to the accumulation of part of plastics in certain spots, we need to understand how these plastics interact with the turbulent structures at the scale of the plastics, at the scale of the fibers. And what we are trying to do is to characterize this interaction in terms of rotation, deformation, and even if it's not mentioned here, also spatial accumulation, because these are all processes that are connected with each other. And clearly the additional ingredient here is flexibility. Now, this is the outline of the talk. So as I already hinted to, I'm going to split the talk into two parts. First, I will focus on light flexible fibers, which represent a proxy for marine microplastics dispersed in turbulent flow. And the second part will be on heavy microplastics, so heavy fibers, where we are going to see a much larger fiber to fluid density ratio. And then I will draw some conclusions. So before I dive directly into these two parts, let me tell you a little bit about the different approaches that we have that are at our disposal for modeling and measuring flexibility, which is the important ingredient here. So here I'm showing you a figure that is taken from this paper here, which is not out yet. It's not being published. It's an annual review of fluid mechanics paper that will come out in 2026, but I dare to show the figure because it has been accepted, so I'm sure that it will be online at some point. And here you see the different approaches in terms of experimental techniques that you can use, but also numerical approaches. And in here, on the horizontal axis, you see the length of the fiber, so its size, compared or scaled by the Kolmogorov length scale, which is the smallest length scale that these fibers will see and interact with in a turbulent flow. So we go from very short fibers, even smaller than the Kolmogorov vortices, to very large fibers, so that span actually the integral length scales of turbulence. So these are very, very long fibers. And here you see on the vertical axis, actually, the parameter, which I'm not going to describe in detail, but basically on these axes, we are representing the capability of fibers to deform under the action of turbulence. So this is really the measure of the flexibility of the fibers. So as you can see here on the bottom part of the axis, we have rigid fibers. On the top part, we have flexible fibers. So you have numerical models, which are classified as continuous or discrete, which are more focusing on relatively shorter fibers. Experiments are typically studying much longer fibers. And as you can see here, there is a sort of overlap between numerical and experimental approaches. And this is exactly the range of parameters that we are exploring. Because in this case, we can also validate our results through experiments. So now, as I said, we are using a numerical approach, which is the discrete approach. So now, if you look at these different numerical approaches, our approach is this one here, the one in the middle. So it's a discrete approach in which the fiber, the flexible fiber, is actually modeled as a chain of beads that have the shape of rods. And these different elements in the chain, they are connected to force and torque constraints. I will tell you a little bit more about how we model this chain of little beads later on. An alternative formulation of the discrete approach is to use spheres instead of rods, right? And this is actually alternative to the other method that has been used in the literature, which is called the continuum approach. In this case, the fiber is really modeled as a continuous filament that evolves subject to fluid structure, coupling forces, and tensions, as it's written here, okay? So these are different methods that you can find in the literature, and I will tell you what we can understand in terms of physics is if we adopt this approach. Now, how can we simulate fibers that are flexible using this discrete approach? We make an approximation, and this approximation is the well-known point particle approximation that has been widely adopted in Lagrangian simulation of particle-laden flows, in particular spheres. Now we are trying to use it for elongated objects in the turbulent flow. Now, again, if you think of the simplest case, which is actually a small sphere, a small spherical particle moving in a turbulent flow, you know that if the particle is smaller than any scale in the turbulent flow, it's much smaller than the grid size of your computational domain. There are very well-known equations that can be used to solve for the trajectory of the particle and its velocity, the translational velocity. So this is a model that has been widely studied, widely applied, very well validated in many different cases. In this case, which is the simplest, you just need to know the trajectory of the particle and its velocity. However, when you depart from the simplest case of a spherical particle, for instance, you consider an elongated particle, even a simple elongated particle, so to say, like an ellipsoid, then you need to take into account also its rotation, its orientation within the flow, and also the dependency of all these quantities on the shape, which here I parameterize through this lambda, which is the aspect ratio of the particle. So these would have lambda larger than 1, this would have lambda equal to 1. And then if you have flexibility, the number of functionalities that you need to include in your simple model, initially simple model, becomes larger and larger. And so the model is getting more and more complicated. Not only you have more modeling, but also you have more controlling parameters. So for instance, if you are dealing with a sphere that is moving in your turbulent flow, you need to know quantities like the Stokes number. So this is a parameter that quantifies the inertial response of the particle to the turbulence fluctuation, so to the motions that the turbulence would like to induce to the particle, the density ratio, the mass fraction, and the volume fraction. Because our fibers are also flexible and elongated, we need to take into account additional parameters. For instance, the aspect ratio. This is somehow a parameterization of the shape effect, and also the bending stiffness, or if you want to use another term, the rigidity. This particle can deform, so they can undergo different deformations based on the material properties of these particles. Some may be more compliant with the turbulence, some others can be less compliant, so more rigid. And here I'm showing, I think, a quite popular picture taken from this unravel fluid mechanics paper by Vota and Soldati, in which you see a sort of summary of the different approaches that can be used from a numerical standpoint to deal with different particles, from spheres to elongated ones, based on the particle size and on the aspect ratio. So I'm not going into detail of this. Of course, this is the spherical case. That's the easy one. We are somehow here in this part of the plot. So we have very large aspect ratio, very long particles. So in principle here, as you can see, the ideal approach would be to use particle resolve methods. So simulations in which the flow around the fibers is explicitly resolved. We are not using this. We are using actually a point particle approximation, which we think can somehow make the numerical resolution easier without losing accuracy. So we are somehow bringing our particles in this part. So from the numerical standpoint, they still have a large aspect ratio, but sort of effective length in terms of length of the individual elements that compose the chain, that is still quite small. So this is what we do. This is what we do. So our flexible fiber is just a sequence of very small rods. The length of each element in the chain that composes the fiber is smaller than the Kolmogorov length scale. So it's really seen as a point effectively by all the turbulent structures that we have in the flow. And these elements are free to rotate, so they cannot, we don't let them detach. So the chain is never broken, but this is just our choice. And in order to keep the elements together, we are imposing constraint forces, which are represented by these X vectors here. And I will tell you a little bit more about this in a moment. Now, for every element, every rod in the chain, we need to solve for the equations of motion. And so we need to know the forces that are acting on each element, but also the torques. And in order to do that, we exploit a very well-known equivalence, which was derived by Cox several decades ago, I would say, in which, from the point of view of the rotational behavior, you can establish an equivalence between a rod and an ellipsoid, which is a simpler shape because, for instance, you don't have sharp edges. And then you can find formulations for the hydrodynamic torques that are acting on this particle for the ellipsoid that you can apply also to the rod. And these torques are very well known in literature. Everybody uses them, or most of the literature you can find is based on the use of the so-called Jeffrey torques. So here I'm splitting these contributions, so hydrodynamic torques, into two parts. So this T here is the contribution that comes from the fact that each element in the chain that forms the fiber can rotate with different rotational velocity with respect to the surrounding fluid. And this H contribution here takes into account that, of course, each rod in the chain is subject to the turbulent fluid velocity gradients. So the local shear, if you want, okay? So that's the typical characterization that you can do. So we are basically applying this expression to every rod in the chain. And when we put everything together, we have nice equations, both for the linear dynamics and, through these torques, the angular dynamics, which look something like this. So here you see the equation of motion, which is nothing but the force balance equation for the translational velocity Vn that we compute for every rod in the chain, subject to the drag force and the constraint forces that keep the rods together, only allowing relative rotation. So these forces here, of course, introduce also an additional torque in the angular dynamics that allow us to compute the rotational velocity of each rod in the chain. Clearly, I already mentioned the Jeffrey torques here, and to make our simulation somehow realistic, we are also including these bending torques, which represent the effect of the material properties of the fiber. So fibers can be more or less rigid depending on the material with which they're made. So we are including this rigidity by sort of including a resistance tensor, which makes the fibers more or less compliant. And this is the expression of the bending stiffness torque, which depends on the Young's modulus, EY. So this is what represents the actual material properties of the fibers. And again, lambda is the aspect ratio, so you can define the aspect ratio from the single rod, but also for the full chain of rods, so the fiber. Now, this part is more focused on the marine microplastics. So here I'm just telling you a little bit about the simulation details that we are using for studying this type of microplastics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because it's basically standard direct numerical simulation approach to turbulence. We are simulating a turbulent channel flow. This is an example of the simulations. This is a sort of representation of the fluid velocity field in the flow. We are changing the shear Reynolds number So these are the values. The flow is always fully turbulent. Clearly, the higher we go with the Reynolds, the more agitated is the flow. And for most of the simulations, we are including two-way coupling. So not only the turbulence is affecting the dynamics of the flow, but also our fibers can modulate the turbulence by exchanging momentum between the phases. And so because we are including two-way coupling, you can see here that the grid points, so the grid resolution that we have to use is quite large, especially at high Reynolds number. And it's actually much larger than an equivalent one-way coupled simulation would require. Okay, so regarding the fibers, we are releasing a large number of fibers, so very large swarms of fibers in the flow. These fibers can be made up to 150 or even 200 rods. This is probably an outdated number. So it's a very, very long chain that looks something like this, okay? And each rod in the chain is slightly smaller than the Kolmogorov scale. So in the channel flow, the Kolmogorov scale changes as a function of the distance from the wall. This is the smallest values that we have in the flow. And this is important because if the single elements in the chain are very small, then they always see a linear velocity profile, so a constant shear rate. And this is one of the assumptions that must be valid in order for the Jeffrey torques to be accurate. So we need to ensure this. As you can see here, we are playing with the length of the fibers by changing the aspect ratio. So we put more and more rods in the chain, such that the length of the fiber, when it is fully stretched, is actually very large. These are values in wall units for those who are familiar with turbulent simulations. So the longest fibers actually fall within the inertial range of turbulence. That means that they're very, very long, right? And the controlling parameters for the fibers are the Stokes number, which again parameterizes the inertia. So larger Stokes number means that there is a longer time lag that the particles require to respond to turbulence. If Stokes is 0, the response is immediate, no inertia. And as I mentioned, the rigidity or bending stiffness controlled by the Young's modulus. So for the marine microplastics, we are considering a relatively small fiber to fluid density ratio, which yields a small Stokes number, so 0.1. From the point of view of the inertial response, then these fibers are almost like tracers, right? So they should be fully compliant with the flow. But the fact that they are very long and flexible changes the picture a little bit compared, for instance, to spherical particles. We are also changing the value of the Young's modulus. So 0 means no rigidity, fully flexible, and values that are larger, again, these are wall units, not physical units, they represent more and more rigid fibers. So the highest values that we can achieve are somehow representative of textile plastic fibers. And you can also convert the material properties into this parameter B, which represents the ratio of viscous to elastic forces. When B is infinite, there is no rigidity, smaller value of B correspond to more and more rigid fibers. And the other point that is important here to mention is that these fibers not only have very small inertia, but also the particle Reynolds number, which is typically a quantity that is not 0 when you have a relative velocity between the particles, so the fibers and turbulence, is basically 0 here. That's another condition for being able to use the Jeffrey torques and for these torques to be accurate. Now, just to tell you a little bit about the kind of fibers that we are releasing into the flow, we have isolated here, and I have to thank Darish for providing me with this picture, just one fiber. So this is one of the fibers that we release in the turbulent flow, which is this guy here. So you can see it's pretty smooth, so the resolution is quite good for the fiber and undergoes strong deformations. And these isosurfaces here that you see are the turbulent coherent structures, so they the vortices, that this fiber sees along its length. So you can see that there are many vortices and so different flow regions that are sampled by the different portions of the fiber. So these are all contributing to the overall dynamics, not only in terms of translation, but also in terms of rotation of the fiber. So really, the behavior of this fiber is non-local. If you have a very small pointwise particle, it will see just one vortex and respond to that vortex. Our fiber responds to many vortices into the flow. So this is somehow making the characterization of the motion of these fibers also kind of complex. Now I see the time is running, so let me go through the results. I will probably have to skip a few of them for the sake of the final discussion, but let's see what comes next. So here I want to show some results that pertain to different let's say, processes that the fibers undergo. So they will tend to somehow get some preferential alignment with the flow. They will tend to deform. They will tend to distribute within the domain. And all these are interconnected, right? So we are trying to examine them in this way. Now here, I'm showing an animation. These are fibers released in a turbulent flow, and this is the central region of the flow, so far away from the walls, where turbulence is closer to being homogeneous and isotropic. So the effect of the walls here is not really felt. And the color map is just showing the different fluid velocity. Red is high velocity, blue is low velocity. And here, of course, nothing can be seen just by visual inspection, but we can examine the alignment, the possible alignment of the fibers with the local velocity gradients and the vorticity. And what we see is that in the center of the flow, so when walls are not important, there is a significant alignment between the fibers and the local vorticity. And this is shown in this picture here, where we have the PDF of the scalar product between the orientation of each element in the fiber with the local vorticity, which is this dashed black line here, okay? So what we can do, we have all these elements in the chain. We know the orientation of each of these elements. We know the orientation of vorticity in that region, and we take the product of these vectors. Then we produce the PDF, and this is what we get. So there is a clear peak at 1 that indicates this preferential alignment. Now, in order to go further and try to compare with experiments, we have also computed the same scalar product now with the eigenvectors E1, E2, E3 of the velocity gradient tensor. So these eigenvectors are connected to the different stretching and compressing regions of the flow. And what we see here is that there is some weak alignment with the second and the first eigenvector, which are related to the stretching regions of the flow, and anti-alignment with the third eigenvector, which represents the compressing regions of the flow. So these are, of course, associated with structures. And the reason why we compute this is that this is exactly what experiments run in homogeneous isotropic turbulence show. So this is a sort of validation of our results with experiments when walls are not taken into account. Now, if you move close to the wall, because we have a channel, then something completely different happens. So here, again, these are the fibers near the wall. The color map is still the velocity, so we have the streaky structures that are well known in wall-bounded turbulence, and this is the same statistics as before. Now, what you see is that there is less alignment and more anti-alignment with the local vorticity. Again, this line here. But you also see that the other PDFs change shape quite a lot. And in particular, you have a peak here for the PDF relative to the third and the first eigenvector. Now, that means that this peak means that they are not perfectly aligned. So the orientation of the rods as somehow is forming an angle with these two eigenvectors. And if you look at what these angles represent, they are actually exactly the angles that characterize the near wall.
Recording in progress.
Okay, there is a recording in progress, I was told. It means that these fibers, albeit being very long and also being deformable, they actually interact with the near wall vortices. So this is a feature of turbulence that was not present in the previous region of the flow, but still indicates that the fibers like to align with whatever turbulent coherent structures they find into the flow. Clearly, different structures will induce different alignment. And this has a strong effect on the rotation. So the type of rotation that these fibers can undergo is usually classified in tumbling and spinning. So for those who are not familiar, I'm showing tumbling and spinning here with reference to a single particle, which is an ellipsoid. And so tumbling is the rotation around the two smaller axes of the particle. Spinning is the rotation along the axis of symmetry. Now, each rod in the chain forming the fiber can undergo these two rotation modes, but not freely. Of course, the influence of the neighboring elements is felt, right? Now, I'm going to show results mainly for tumbling here. This is the mean square tumbling rate as a function of the distance from the wall. So you see here a bunch of colored curves, which are our simulations. Here, the simulations refer to fibers with different length, different rigidity. If you just look at them in a collective manner, you can see that the tumbling is smaller in the center of the channel, increases near the wall. And this is in line with experimental measurements, which are the black symbols, which, however, refer to rigid fibers. So we cannot make a one-to-one comparison in terms of flexibility. Still, there seems to be a sort of qualitative agreement in terms of trends. Close to the channel center, we overlap with the results of the experiment, with the measurements, possibly indicating that the flexibility here is not important, whereas it is important close to the wall. So it induces stronger tumbling. And the effect of rigidity is to reduce the tumbling all the time. This is at small Reynolds number. If we increase the Reynolds number, we see something similar as before. So again, here the colored symbols are our simulations, now referring to a much higher Reynolds number of the turbulence. Again, different lengths, different rigidities. The black symbols here are the same experiments as before. And what you can notice, besides the fact that rigidity always tends to decrease the tumbling, is that we have small tumbling in the center of the channel. So here, this is an effect of turbulence. So this is not very straightforward to understand, but if we increase the Reynolds number in the flow, you have a more quiet region, a sort of quiescent turbulent core in the center of the channel. So turbulence is less agitated, if I can say so, in the center of the channel, and this allows a lower rotation in general for the fibers. Okay, so let's say, since I think I have something like 5 minutes more, I will just show you very quickly some results that pertain the deformation of the fibers. And then I will try to connect these results with the local curvature that is measured. So most of the times, what we see in our simulation is a sort of smooth bending of the fibers. So the fibers are deforming with a sort of constant curvature. And in order to quantify this deformation, one observable that is typically used is the effective end-to-end distance. However, sometimes the deformation is a bit more complex, so the curvature is not smooth. It can change quite abruptly. It's a sort of buckling type of deformation that happens. And so we can have the same end-to-end or effective distance, but different distribution of curvature. So in order to properly characterize the different deformation modes, we are using a second observable, which is taken from the literature. It's called the radius of gyration. Again, without entering into the details, these additional parameters telling us how differently the mass is distributed along the fiber depending on its deformation. So if we put these two quantities together, of course, we can measure this for every fiber in our flow. And for instance, we condition our statistics to the near region, and this is a statistical result that we typically get. So here, this is a joint probability of the radius of gyration and the effective end-to-end distance. Both are normalized for fibers that have no rigidity and basically no inertia. So when we are close to 1 here in this plot, it means that the fiber is not deformed. The straight fiber has this probability equal to 1. If we go towards 0, this corresponds to very strong deformation events. So what you can see here is that the highest probability, this sort of yellow, is for very weak deformation events. But we do have finite probabilities of having a much stronger bending. This is what happens for a sort of ideal marine microplastics for which there is no rigidity. If we take into account the rigidity of actual microplastics, then we get something like this. So here we are increasing the rigidity, and what you see is that we are killing the strongest deformation events in the flow, especially those with irregular distribution of curvature, and we can have still smooth bending. Now, this is if we just look at the effect of the material properties. But again, and I'm skipping this for the sake of the discussion, we can...
5 minutes, Cristian.
Yes. I was actually hoping to finish in less than that.
No problem.
Yes, so what I was saying is that we can try to relate or include also the effect of length on the type of deformation that the fibers can undergo. And this is shown here in this plot. So here you can see the maximum curvature that we can measure along our fibers. So we can do this for each fiber in the flow as a function of their length. This is the aspect ratio again. So the smaller the aspect ratio, the shorter the fiber. And these are the different maximum curvatures. Of course, we can average over all the fibers for different material properties. So the blue line is the ideal case in which the fibers have zero rigidity, and these are the actual marine microplastics. So you can see that there is a strong effect of the material properties on the curvature, so on the deformation, when the fiber is not very long, but this seems to become weaker when the fiber is much longer. And indeed, if we, for instance, consider the short fibers, you see that when we increase the rigidity, we are in fact killing the very complex and very strong deformation events. So our fibers can really undergo only smooth bending. But if they're long enough, sorry, I jumped too much. If they're long enough, then the effect of the material properties become less and less important. So what matters is the length. And you can see it here that increasing the rigidity is not really preventing very complex buckling. Okay, so I had some more results, which I'm going to skip because I want to show at least something about the atmospheric microplastics. So as I mentioned before, the main change here is the density ratio. So just to remind you, small density ratio means small Stokes number and also small particle Reynolds number. However, to simulate something that is relevant for atmospheric dispersion, we need to increase the density ratio. That means that we have to increase the Stokes number, and more importantly, our particle Reynolds number will not be zero. So we are moving outside of the range of validity of the Jeffrey torques. So the equations that we were using before must be corrected, right? And this is exactly the point. So we are moving into a regime when the particle Reynolds number is not zero anymore, and we need to do something. And this something is to correct the Jeffrey torques. Now, again, if you're interested, I can give you more details about what is the effect of having a zero particle Reynolds number. In few words, now, in addition to particle inertia, we must take into account the effect of fluid inertia in the flow. And this can be done. There is a lot of literature on this. Many papers have been published. So these are just some examples of theories that provide correction to the Jeffrey torques. And what we are doing here, we are using one correction that is solely based on the slip velocity. Now, with this correction, we can have a good theoretical framework for the atmospheric plastics. And again, if I am allowed a few more minutes, these are works that somehow prove the effect or the importance of the inertia of the fluid. I just want to show something about this spatial distribution of the plastics when they are dispersed in a flow of air, related to their tendency to accumulate at the wall. So here you have the concentration, it's an unbound density distribution, as a function of the distance from the wall. This is for the ideal case of particles with zero rigidity, a certain length, and these are the atmospheric plastics. You can see that they accumulate, while the blue line is the case we've seen before for the marine plastics. We have not seen before, actually, I skipped the slide, but for the marine microplastics, there is no accumulation at the wall. There is an accumulation at the wall for the heavy plastics. Now, this is determined by the higher inertia, the higher Stokes number. But again, let's make our fibers longer and longer. So if we increase the length, we are seeing a smaller tendency to accumulate. So there is no peak anymore, okay? So again, there is an interplay between the inertia represented by Stokes and the length, right? And you can see it here if we put all these curves together. So near the wall, inertia determines a peak. There is also an effect of length. If we now scale the normal coordinate by the length, we can isolate the effect of inertia, and we see that this becomes important in a region close to the wall that is actually scaling with the length of the fibers, of the atmospheric fibers. And this is due, again, to this interplay. So inertial particles would like to move as much as possible towards a solid wall, but because they are getting longer and longer, this effect is counteracting this accumulation. And therefore, the overall distribution inside your flow depends on the relative importance of these two effects. So I think I took maybe even a bit more time than I was allowed, but I wanted to somehow also cover this because I think it's interesting to see the different mechanisms at play. And it's an example of the physical understanding that we hope we can get from our simulations. So I have also a slide of conclusions, which is this one. I will hit it right here. Here there are some references, and I thank everybody for the attention. I apologize for running in the last part, but I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Yes, Cristian, Professor Marchioli, thank you very much for this wonderful overview. Not only overview, I would say, you've gone quite into some of the details of this very complex and complicated work, long-standing questions addressed with very rigorous and also very impressive, computationally intensive simulations. Now the work is open for questions. I hope the questions will also allow you to add some more of the topics that you've just touched in your presentation. If there is anyone willing to ask questions directly by voice, otherwise, please do so. Otherwise, I will start with the chat. I will try one and one. If there is anyone intervening directly.
In the meantime, I'm reading the chat as well, because I see there are some questions.
Okay. I will read them loudly so that anyone will also look at the question. I see no one intervening directly, so we will start with the chat questions. The first one is coming from Professor Yao. So he says, very impressive compared with particles. Could you please provide some comments for the differences between with fibers? For example, the concentration with turbulence and so on. Would you take this one, this first one?
Yes. So the main difference here is something that I hinted to. It's the fact that we have very long fibers. So the overall behavior in terms of translation and rotation is not really determined by the interaction of the fiber with one vortical structure or one coherent structure, but multiple of them. So it's really a non-local phenomenon. So clearly we have a sort of chain of interconnecting elements responding differently to turbulence. And this has an effect on the concentration. If you run simulations with small spherical particles in the same turbulent flow condition, you will always see a strong accumulation due to the inertia. Clearly, if you remove inertia, there will always be a sort of more homogeneous distribution. But spherical particles with the same inertia, so the same Stokes number of the atmospheric plastics, would just deposit at the wall, no matter what. What we see here is that if we counteract inertia with length, we are completely changing the distribution. Actually, you can also get void regions near the wall. So the overall behavior is really different. And this is due to the fact that, of course, you have a much, much longer fiber that responds to turbulent structures in different portions of the domain. And
sorry, Christian, based on your simulation, do you find some similar phenomenon of the particles? For example, for the no turbulence, the particles actually like to concentrate in the turbulence with a low value, but in the high turbulence, that particles actually distribution more. Usually in the turbulence of the pipes of the boundaries, there are sticks. Yeah, you can see to the sticks due to this the turbulence on the particles concentrations. So for your fibers, do you get a similar phenomenon as this?
In terms of inertial response to turbulence, yes.
Yes, okay.
Then, of course, you have the length that enters into play, and this cannot be removed from our simulation. But if you just look at the sort of turbophoretic drift, when you have spherical particles, of course, I'm talking about heavy, so inertial particles that tend to have a non-homogeneous distribution. So in terms of response to turbophoresis, through the Stokes number, that is very similar.
Okay.
Clearly, you can never rule out the effect of length and also the effect of deformation, because that's another thing. If you have a rigid fiber that is very long, it will also interact with many vortices, but it will not deform, so it will not move or rotate as a flexible fiber. So there are different degrees of complexity that we are adding here, compared to the small sphere, which it's a case I like a lot because it's the simplest thing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was a little bit more from Yao. The second is simulation of fibers seems much more complex than particles. I'm wondering, do you make some validation of your simulation? For example, comparing with experimental data.
Yes, so I have shown some comparison with experimental data. Of course, we have more statistics that we can compare. I have to say that if we look at wall-bounded flows, there are, to my knowledge, basically no experiments dealing with flexible fibers. There are experiments dealing with straight rigid fibers or curved fibers that anyway are not deformable. And these are the experiments I showed before. If we want to compare flexible fibers, we need to make comparison with experiments in homogeneous isotropic turbulence. So these are cases in which they have measured flexible fibers. So we can make comparison. We actually did, and to my surprise, sometimes they are quite good. But we can compare our results in the channel flow only in the central portion of the channel, where the turbulent conditions sort of match those of experiments. In general, there are not many experiments we can compare with. So of course, this is a sort of I'm calling for experiments which are not easy to make. They are very complex. Even when you have a rigid fibers, just to detect the fiber within the flow and measure its rotation, that's a very complex task. Imagine when the fiber is flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I fully agree. And also, well, one question that probably also sparked my mind in being amazed by your capacity to take all these many phenomena into account, one goes over with the mind and then wonders whether you could also consider interaction between fibers in a way that, as concentration goes high, increases, you may have some mechanical interaction between the fibers.
Yes. I have to say, there is no interaction between fibers here. In fact, even in a single fiber, as it deforms, the fibers could, the elements of the same fiber could touch each other. We don't have that here. And that's because, on the one hand, we never reach a local mass and volume fraction that would sort of justify the inclusion of this. And also because there has been some studies in the literature in the group of Marco Rosti in Japan, based on simulations in homogeneous isotropic turbulence, that show that for the same dilute suspension, the interactions are really rare. We also made a sort of a priori estimation of the contacts that we would have, and they are really very small. This is not to say that these are not important. They are actually very important. But I would say, in order for them to matter in our simulation, we will need to increase the volume fraction by at least 1 order of magnitude, and that's already an accomplishment. But this is something we are including right now, because, of course, in many of the practical situations in which you have flexible fibers, for instance, think of polymers. The scales are completely different, but you can have these elastic chains. Then, of course, they will tend to form agglomerates. And in order to study how these agglomerates form, you really need to take into account the interaction. So this is an ongoing work, and I hope that maybe 1 year from now we will have some results, because clearly in the detection of the collisions is computationally expensive by itself. So we are working on that, and that's very important. We don't have it yet.
Yes, coming from discrete element method simulation, as you probably know, Cristian, we are fully aware of the complexity of contact detection, which with elongated object is even more complicated. There is one more from the chat. A nice talk from you, Guo.
Thank you.
Nice talk. For the fiber fluid interaction, is the fiber surface fully resolved? So you may miss this part.
No, it's not. It's not. Yeah, he said I missed the first part. It's something I mentioned in the beginning, but the point is exactly, we don't want to resolve the flow around the fiber, so around the surface of the fiber. Because you can look at this picture here. You can see that we are releasing a large number of fibers, each made by rods. So in a typical simulation, we would have 10 to 100 million rods, and we need to solve the equation of motion for each of these plus the constraint. So the point is that since we are interested in large numbers of fibers, the pointwise approach is the only one that allows us to reach these numbers with sort of affordable computational time. Clearly, the fully resolved simulation would be the best in terms of accuracy. We need to include some modeling in our simulations, but there are efforts to sort of include the finite size effects, because this is what we're talking about, finite size effects in the point particle approach, to mimic or hopefully replicate the actual flow behavior around the fiber. So this is also something that we are trying to work and move towards, because again, running the case that you see here with fully resolved particle simulation would be impossible, or it would take an enormous amount of time, more than a lifetime. And so I think we really need a combination of different approaches, so experiments, fully resolved simulation, point particle simulations, in order to really understand the physics. So what I'm saying is, this is the method we use. Of course, we need to improve it based on experiments and other simulation approaches.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Any few last questions? Professor Yao is thanking you for the talk. I have just a very quick curiosity regarding your tools. I imagine, I mean, is the software you use somehow shareable, open source, and also on the hardware side, are you using HPC, I imagine? So can you
Yes.
give us a little bit of framework
So
from that point?
the code that we are using is an in-house code. So it's a pseudospectral code. I think it was written in one of the slides. I didn't mention it. So it's a pseudospectral code for the turbulence part, because clearly we need to be as accurate as possible in the calculation of the velocity gradients. This is what really matters to us, because of course they are crucial for the rotation in particular.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we are also coupling this with the Lagrangian part of the code, which is the approach that we use for tracking the fibers. Now, because it's a pseudospectral code, it's not something very easy to use in the sense that even if we would share it, it's not open source, but it can be, of course, shared. It's just that I didn't have the guts to put it on GitHub in a way, you know. It's not just, okay, I put it there and people use it. No, it's a bit more difficult. Don't know what's happening here. I'm maybe writing something.
No problem.
On the slide. Anyway, so it's not yet open source. And from the point of view of the parallelization, it's of course running on multiple CPUs. And in particular, the results I showed you today were obtained on GPUs. So the code is GPU ready. And we need to have that because we need really to speed up the simulations if we want to get something in a reasonable amount of time. So really HPC and being able to use GPUs is crucial here. So we spent a lot of time because porting a pseudospectral code on GPUs is not really easy. It's a complicated
task.
So
you're using European level resources, or you have your own?
Yes. This we run on the HPC center. Is not something we can run, at least the production runs. We don't have a cluster in our university, so we rely on HPC centers in Italy, Cineca, you know for sure, or other European centers like Jülich, so Germany, Finland. Whoever has new-based clusters, we are asking for computational time. Yes.
Excellent. With that, I think we can say a very big thank you for your talk, Professor Marchioli. Thank you very much for your very interesting, very impressive set of results that you've shared. Also very informative, very clear presentation. We appreciate that very much, and look forward to having you for the upcoming keynote.
Yeah, just one thing. Since I skipped some slides, we are sharing the slides. Of course, everybody who is interested in knowing a little bit more is welcome to contact me by email, and I would be more than happy to tell more.
That's very nice of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot. I stopped sharing, I guess, otherwise.
Yes.